Hi, I'm Daniel Arkin. I'm here today with Bing Liu, the director of the Oscar-nominated film Minding the Gap. Bing, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So it's been a whirlwind few months for you, got an Oscar nomination. How has it been sort of going from your old life to your current life?
I feel like a Midwest bumpkin stumbling around Hollywood and, just wide-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Had you spent any time in LA before?
I have,
all
yeah,
this?
I kid. I've spent a lot of time in LA, but never in this, inside of the velvet ropes LA.
Right, right.
But it's been amazing. I think the most amazing thing has just been getting messages every day from people that talk about how much the film has affected them, and just amazing stories of how a teenager has tried talking to their parents for the first time in a couple years because they're impacted by the film, or young parents talking about how they're just becoming a lot more self-aware of their actions because they're realizing oh no, everything that I do sort of really matters and is really absorbed by my children. So
Right. On the surface, this is seemingly a documentary about skateboarding culture in Illinois, but you actually see the thing and it turns out to be much more serious, and it grapples with some themes including domestic abuse. How did that evolve?
Well, it was sort of reverse engineered. I think the subject matter sort of came first. 5 or 6 years ago, I was in my early 20s, and I was traveling the country, and I was sitting people down and following people from all over to create this mosaic of young skateboarders and them grappling with the past, grappling with growing up, really processing what had happened in their families and who they're becoming. And then a year in, I went back to Rockford, Illinois, which is the Rust Belt sort of city that I grew up in. And that's when I met one person who would become one of the main characters in the film, Kier, and this other guy who I knew a little bit as a teenager, who was about to become a father. Around that time, and at that time it was it was very, it was literally guys on screen, and women too. And there's some women skateboarders who talked about abuse and, trauma. But around that time, that's when I started working with Kartemquin Films in Chicago, who's best known for the documentary Hoop Dreams. And I sort of just freebased documentaries like that. And I realized, oh no, documentaries can be like fiction films. They can be like stories that take you on a journey through characters. And the subject matter, the themes can come out of those stories. And so I shifted track and just started committing to these two guys. And sure enough, their stories were, I guess, something you couldn't even make up.
You had history with these two guys. They were acquaintances from childhood, obviously.
Well, one of them I didn't meet, one of them is 8 years younger than me,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't, he knew who I was, but I never even met him. But the other guy, he, I skated with him a few times, but he lived in a suburb of Rockford, and so when I came back, that's when I really got to know them. But I think part of the access that I got was from them, watching my skate videos when I was growing up. I was the one person who really took it seriously, and everybody wanted to be in my videos. So when I came back, they were like, "Oh, cool! Bing is coming back to make a skate video on us. Why is he trying to get us to talk about our dads all the time? Why is he trying to get us, when we're off the board all the time?"
Kier and Zach are both very open and candid on camera. How did you essentially solicit their trust or draw them out? Because they both, through the course of the film, are very open about their own shortcomings and demons and some of the trauma in their lives.
I think people have a really good antenna for where you're coming from when you want to dish with them or have a truth circle or whatever. And I feel like I love living in that place of truth circle, and I felt like I wanted to get there a lot in adolescence. And some people would play along, other people wouldn't. But I just feel like I just kept flexing that muscle as I was growing up. And if you're making a film on someone and you want to get to that honest sort of dishing place between two people, I think people just can feel whether you come from a place of curiosity and true wonder, or whether you come from a place of wanting to really prove a point that you already have, or like extract something from them to, fit into your film. And it was an exploration, especially in the beginning, before I knew where the stories were going to go. Like one of the conversations in the film that I feel like is very powerful is Kier and I commiserating about crying after getting beaten,
Yeah.
and sort of just like talking about that crying and owning it. And that was our first interview together. I mean, like and it was like this
Wow.
2-hour interview, and it's like his whole story, his whole like internal emotional story, like really just was laid out right then and there. And the rest of the time just became about like, following the external happenings of his life, which was all about just like getting a car, getting a job, trying to move out of the city.
There's a particularly powerful moment in the film when Kier compares the interview process to therapy. And I'm wondering if you found that to be true in your own part of the film, in which you talk about your own history with abuse.
I felt like I was more the therapist. I didn't really get space to process until the film came out and, I started doing interviews and press. I mean, this is my therapy right now, actually, so thank you. But I started seeing a therapist while I was making the film, so that was like my therapy. And there was a relationship between making the film and doing therapy. Once I got to a certain point, I showed my therapist a rough cut of the film, and we like psychoanalyzed Zach together, and it was like cool because it was, it felt a lot more clinical than, filmmakers giving me notes. And I think it laid the groundwork for me to share my story with my therapist, actually, and which affected my ability to tell my own story, which was a later decision in the film.
With Zach in particular, in the course of the film, he's accused of domestic abuse by his ex-girlfriend, Nina. And I'm wondering how you were able to sort of draw him out both as an old friend and as someone who might view him in a potentially more judgmental or unfavorable light, given what he was accused of.
It's funny, I think people ask me that a lot, and I didn't really think of it in that framework. I thought of it more as like, how do I get him on board with the project? Because I don't think this film could have worked if any of the people who were in the film weren't like supportive of the film coming out. At the same time, that was butted up against like me having to hold him accountable in the film to satisfy my moral compass. And then I had to consider, like the safety and the livelihood of Nina. And I guess my first step intuitively was just to ask Nina, like, how do I proceed? She told me not to confront him. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I wanted to keep, sort of broaching the subject. What I ended up doing, I think, was, and I don't know how purposeful this was, but I just kept going. There's this one cell phone recording of Zach and Nina's relationship getting volatile to a degree that's probably the most like fierce in the film. I just kept revisiting that with Zach, and this is like almost a therapeutic device. Like you just revisit an event over and over and over again, and you start to just really unpack it more. And as I kept just asking Zach more details about that night, and part of it was out of frustration. I felt like I was getting all of these pieces from both Zach and Nina about what happened. But eventually, Zach, and this is in the film, Zach gets to a place where it's not even about the details of that night. It's about him pontificating about his views of how to deal with volatile relationships with women. And I think that was, that both said enough and satisfied what I felt like I needed in the film, and it came from him. It wasn't me trying to get this he said, she said thing. It became more of a, it got exalted to a high, like a 20,000 foot level thing.
Right. There's a chapter in the film in which you have what felt to me like a very painful conversation with your own mother, in which you both discuss your stepfather who was abusive to you as a child. How did you essentially get your mom on board to agree to open up and make herself vulnerable on camera?
It wasn't, I don't know why she said yes, but my mom and I didn't have much of a relationship growing up. I was born in China, and she was going to school and working all the time, so I was under the care of my grandparents for much of my first few years. And then when we moved to the States, my parents divorced almost immediately, and she was like off working, and I was probably, illegally left at home like as a young child. And so I spent a lot of time just not really getting to know her. And then when she married my stepfather, like she was the main breadwinner of the house, so she was always working as well. And then by the time I entered my teenage years, I just was like running away from home all the time because my stepfather was becoming abusive. And then I went to Chicago, and I just sort of like severed. I feel like emotionally, I was like, I can't. Like I'm just like severing my ties with that household. So when I started making this film, that was when things got so bad with my stepfather and my mom. Like he like shot a gun at her in the house, and like things were getting really violent. She finally decided to move out for good and try to get a divorce. And so that was sort of like happening in the background of me making the film. And it was before I thought about putting my story in the film. But then I started like trying to broach the subject a little bit of just revisiting the past and talking about what happened. And it was always really difficult because, like one of us would get upset or just be too hard to change the subject. And so I guess I thought of that interview as an opportunity to just, like talk about it for longer, I guess, in a way. But when I asked her, it was just like a simple email. Hey, Mom, I've been working on this documentary for a few years. I'd love to interview, and we'd talk about Dennis, who's my stepfather, and and then she's like, sure, what date? And then like the rest of the email thread is just like us trying to find a date, I've never, even when we like showed up and like, cause I had this other camera crew like filming me, and looking at the footage, there was like no sense of like dread or like nervousness going into it. I guess I didn't even I didn't expect to I didn't expect to challenge her. I thought it was going to be an expository interview about just like laying out what had happened, and in that trying to just like get backstory for the filmmaker as a character. Like after we started cutting that scene, I couldn't work with the raw footage. I only worked with the transcripts. It's really hard for me to go back. And every time I cut that scene, it was very expository. And then when my co-editor came on, Josh, his first pass of that scene was sort of what you see in the film. And I had a blind spot to that part of the interview, which is, me sort of like trying to like get, like settle a score almost with my mom, which is something that I can't believe I didn't even see it, or I didn't even remember it.
How have Kier and Zach reacted to being featured in the film?
Well, I mean, it's been over a year now since the film has been out, but we sat them down about a month before and showed them the film. Zach thought he was going to get portrayed worse than he is in the film, and so he said he was actually relieved. Kier cried every time he cried on screen, and he laughed every time he laughed on screen. And since then, they've just gotten more and more used to, I guess, people, judging them for their stories on screen, and also, messaging them and coming up to them in public and going, hey, I know you. But for the most part, they're just sort of like living their lives.
A lot of reviews of the film have tried to put it in a wider context. Specifically, this is a portrait of a group of young guys growing up in this depressed, crumbling Midwestern town. Was that kind of context on your mind in the making of the film? Were you trying to look for political resonance, or were you looking at these guys as symbolic of some larger social issues happening in that region of the country?
For a couple years now, partially because the socioeconomic realities of Rockford are so just familiar to me. It didn't stand out as that important. Also, I feel like as I was watching more docs, I felt like there was a lot of blame of socioeconomic status in individual lives, which I didn't think necessarily, is fair to people's lives, especially the people I was following. But I wanted to do justice to the realities of Rockford too. It does have some like really staggering statistics, and I don't know. But I was really nervous and really hesitant about every different way I tried to bring that out. Like there's a few different ways. I mean, there's news there's like short little news snippets that you just hear in radio voice about just some of the statistics, like it's, you know, highest violent crime rate per capita and with a city under 200,000. 25% of that violent crime comes from domestic violence calls. And then there's other things. I filmed billboards that are like PSAs for, you know, the ad council, for like positive messages about the positive effects of being a good father, for example. And a lot of those things, just like, I was so scared it was just too on the nose and too, you know, for a film that was trying to go for subtlety. But, you know, most people like it, some people don't. I mean, that's the risky run, I think, with making choices like that.
You mentioned that Hoop Dreams was one of the inspirations for the project in a way, or at least was on your mind in making it. Were there other films, whether they're documentary or narrative features, that informed your approach here, or that you felt you were paying homage to in some way?
Yeah, the movie Gummo, I love that movie. I think, you know, it really gets at a part of the country that is just forgotten. The movie Waking Life, which is the movie that made me want to become a filmmaker, is just one of the best pieces of Inquisition, in earnest, like authentic Inquisition, that I feel like I've ever seen. Actually, Steve James' second film, I think, influenced me a lot more than Hoop Dreams, and that film is called Stevie. And part of what makes that film so wonderful is that, you know, it deals with the filmmaking ethic so much. Like, it's part and parcel of what the film is. Sherman's March, which is this classic 80s first-person documentary where it's the filmmaker sets out to make one film and it becomes something else, and it's comical and endearing. I mean, so many, I feel like I watched so many films during that time period and trying to figure out, you know, all these problems that I needed solutions for in my film.
Who do you hope sees Minding the Gap?
That 12-year-old kid in rural Arkansas who doesn't really have any other document or any other adult figure in their life to tell them, hey, you don't have to continue this cycle. Like, this isn't your you don't have to, like, sort of like be defeated by this perceived destiny. Like, you have volition in your life and you're going to survive to tell your tale.
I assume you might want to leave some mystery around the meaning of the title, but I'd love your
It's
take
just
on
it's
what
a
it
horrible
means.
title. I mean, I have like so many regrets about the title. I didn't know what the tube was. I'd never been to London before, you know, making the film, and it was just one of those phrases that bounced around my head. You know, I must have heard it somewhere, but it was, you know, it's. I feel like I had this idea, this like phrase this idea in my head about how skateboarding is 90% mental. Like, it's, you know, it obviously takes a little physical prowess, but if you can imagine, you can do it. Like, you know, you have to try and fail, but you'll do it. And I think, you know, you can translate that into, you know, becoming an adult, becoming a better person, you know, learning how to be a man. And those are gaps, you know, those things that you have to get over. And, you know, a lot of it is just being, like, minding them, being aware of them, and, you know, mentally, just believing that you can do it. I don't know, it's so cheesy.
No, in some
Okay.
ways it feels like the film was your way of stepping over that gap.
It was an attempt. It definitely, like, came out of almost like a fear of becoming my stepfather. Like, even though I felt like I tried really hard not to become him, I just noticed people sort of like accidentally becoming their parents or taking on traits like that, and I don't know. I mean, I wanted to explore it more, almost as sort of like a precaution for myself.
Are there other projects you're working on right now, documentary or otherwise?
Yeah, there's a few spinning plates. We're going in a post on a documentary that I'm co-directing with Josh Altman, who came on Minding the Gap to cut with me. It's about confronting the past and your emotions in order to move forward, as it pertains to young men who experience gun violence in Chicago. And then I have another one getting off the ground about millennial love, intimacy, and dating, and that's a story that takes place around the world. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here today. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a wound on my hand from skateboarding, so I'm going to shake.